We're going to be looking at the heart, and the heart is a muscular pump. It's actually a double pump system, and it's roughly the size of your fist. The resting heart is a remarkable organ, and it beats close to 3 million times per month, and that would be a phenomenal number of beats in a year. And you realize that the heart beats, like billions of times if you live to be 70, 80, or 90 years old. The main function of the heart is to receive blood that is under a very low pressure in the venous return to the heart, and then pump that blood out at a high pressure, so it'll circulate through miles and miles of blood vessels. The heart is located in the mediastinum, which is the space between the lungs above the diaphragm in the thoracic or chest cavity. The heart, almost when you talk about base and apex, feels as if you're talking about an organ that's upside down. But the bottom of the heart, what we would call the bottom, is the apex of the heart, and it rests on top of the diaphragm. And then the top of the heart is the base of the heart. So this is an illustration showing the heart, and here would be the heart in the mediastinum, the space found between the lungs. The apex of the heart rests on top of the diaphragm, and these large blood vessels, the pulmonary trunk, aorta, and the superior vena cava are coming out of the base of the heart. The heart is covered by a double-walled sac known as the pericardium. And the pericardium consists of an inner wall called the serous pericardium and an outer wall called the fibrous pericardium. So we'll look first at the inner portion of the pericardium known as the serous pericardium. And we'll find that the serous pericardium consists of two layers, a visceral layer and a parietal layer. So the visceral layer is also called the epicardium. That's one of the three layers of the heart wall. And the visceral layer of the serous pericardium lies on the surface of the heart. And then it reflexes back on itself to form the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, which is the inner lining of the fibrous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is made of a fibrous connective tissue, dense regular connective tissue, and it makes up the outer portion of the pericardium. There's a cavity filled with pericardial fluid called the pericardial cavity that's found between the two layers, the visceral and parietal layers of the serous pericardium. When we take a look at the wall of the heart, it consists of three layers. The epicardium is the outer layer of the heart. It's also the same as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and it's a very thin surface layer. The middle layer is by far the thickest layer. That's the myocardium, and it's made up mostly of cardiac muscle cells. The myocardium is a very vascular layer with networks of blood vessels running through it, lots of capillary beds, and of course you've got motor neurons associated with the autonomic nervous system, to include parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons that help to regulate the heart function. The endocardium is the inner layer, and it forms the lining of the heart chambers. It's continuous with the endothelium that lines blood vessels, and it's essentially made of simple squamous epithelium. So this would be roughly the heart, and these would be the heart chambers, the atria and the ventricles. And the pericardium is the double-walled sac around the heart. So the outermost portion of the pericardium is the fibrous pericardium. And then what I've drawn there in yellow would be the two layers of the serous pericardium. But the visceral and the parietal layers together make up the serous pericardium. There's a fluid-filled cavity found between the two layers of the serous pericardium, known as the pericardial cavity. The wall of the heart consists of three layers. The epicardium is the outermost layer, and it's the same thing as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. And then the middle and thickest layer is the myocardium, and the lining of the heart chambers is the endocardium. I'll move this up a little bit. This illustration shows the pericardium consisting of the fibrous pericardium, which is the outermost portion of the pericardium, and the serous pericardium, shown here in blue, which has two layers, and that's the inner layer of the pericardium. So the pericardium is a double-walled sac consisting of an outer fibrous pericardium and an inner serous pericardium. The serous pericardium, in turn, is divided into two layers, the parietal layer and the visceral layer. The parietal layer is just underneath the fibrous pericardium, and the visceral layer is on the surface of the heart. The visceral layer is also known as the epicardium. There's a cavity filled with a pericardial fluid, it's very watery, called the pericardial cavity. That's between the two layers that make up the serous pericardium. Inside the heart, there are four chambers. The atria are the upper chambers. Singular would be atrium. And the atria are sometimes referred to as receiving chambers because the atria receive blood coming into the heart from large veins. The atria consist of an atrium on the left side and one on the right side. The one on the left side is known as the left atrium, and I'll abbreviate that LA. And the left atrium receives venous return from the pulmonary circuit by way of veins known as pulmonary veins. And the right atrium, which I'll abbreviate RA, receives venous return from the systemic circuit via the superior and inferior vena cava. There are expandable pouches on the sides of the atria, known as auricles. There is a wall of cardiac muscle between the right and the left atria, known as the interatrial septum. The lower chambers are called ventricles, and they are the pumping chambers. And there's one on the right side and one on the left side. The right ventricle, which I'll abbreviate RV, is sometimes referred to as the pulmonary pump, because when the right ventricle contracts, it pumps blood out of the heart into an artery called the pulmonary trunk artery, usually just called the pulmonary trunk, that delivers blood into the pulmonary circuit, or a circuit of blood vessels associated with the lungs. The left ventricle, which I'll abbreviate LV, is sometimes referred to as the systemic pump. And when the left ventricle contracts, it pumps its blood out of the heart into an artery called the aortic artery, usually just called the aorta, and from there into the systemic circuit. So this is a pretty good detailed illustration of the heart, and this would be the apex of the heart that rests on top of the diaphragm. This would be the base of the heart, and the pulmonary trunk, aorta, and superior vena cava are coming out of the base of the trunk. This would be the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And on the sides of the atria are expandable pouches called auricles. The venous return from the pulmonary circuit comes into the left atrium by way of the pulmonary veins. The left atrium wraps around behind the heart. So here's a couple of pulmonary veins that are emptying blood into the left atrium, which you can't see because it's behind the heart. So these would be the superior and the inferior vena cava that are entering blood into the right atrium. When the right ventricle contracts, it pumps its blood out into the pulmonary trunk, and then by way of pulmonary arteries to the lungs. And when the left ventricle contracts, it pumps its blood into the aorta, which delivers that blood into the systemic circuit. So there are two circuits of blood in the body, and each is a complete set of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. The two circuits of blood in the body are the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. Now, a circuit is a system of blood vessels and only includes the blood vessels. It does not include the heart chambers associated with the circuit. The systemic circuit is the circuit of blood vessels that delivers blood that's high in oxygen or rich in oxygen to the cells of the body, where the cells use the oxygen to make ATP by cellular respiration. Cells generate carbon dioxide as a gaseous waste product of cellular respiration, and the systemic circuit picks up that CO2. The systemic circuit begins at the aorta as it comes out of the left ventricle and ends at the vena cava. The left ventricle is sometimes referred to as the systemic pump because it pumps its blood into the systemic circuit by way of the aorta. The pulmonary circuit is a circuit of blood vessels exclusively associated with the lungs, and it delivers blood that is low in oxygen and high in CO2 to capillaries within the lungs over the air sacs, and then the pulmonary capillaries allow you to pick up oxygen that comes in as you inhale and then get rid of the carbon dioxide as you exhale. The pulmonary circuit begins at the pulmonary trunk and ends at the pulmonary veins. The right ventricle is sometimes known as the pulmonary pump because it pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, to the rest of the pulmonary circuit. There's a couple blood vessels associated with the heart that I want you to know. First of all, the right and left coronary arteries are rather large arteries that arise from the base of the aorta, and they deliver blood to the extensive system of blood vessels within the myocardium, the wall of the heart. There are veins associated with the heart called cardiac veins, and they eventually drain into a large vein known as the coronary sinus that opens directly into the right atrium. Blood flow through the heart is unidirectional, or one way. Blood comes into the atria, from the atria to the ventricles pump blood out into the arterial outlets. Right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle into the aorta. So the one-way valves, AV valves and semilunar valves, regulate one-way flow of blood through the heart. We'll talk first about the AV valves. So the AV valves are the atrioventricular valves because they're one-way valves found between the atria and the ventricles. There's two of these valves. One of them is the tricuspid valve, which has three flaps or cusps, and it's the right AV valve found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And then you've got the mitral or the bicuspid valve, which is the left AV valve found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The tricuspid valve has three cusps or flaps, and the mitral or bicuspid valve has two flaps or two cusps. Chordae tendineae are sometimes referred to as heart strings, and they're little cords of fibrous connective tissue that connect the edges of the flaps to the tops of papillary muscles. And the papillary muscles are columns of cardiac muscle coming off the ventricular walls. Here's an illustration showing the AV valves. So the flaps are shown in yellow. This would be the tricuspid valve found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And this would be the mitral or bicuspid valve found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The edges of the flaps are connected by string-like structures called the chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae attach the edges of the flaps to the tops of papillary muscles. The papillary muscles are columns of muscle, cardiac muscle, coming off the interventricular walls. So blood can go from the atria through openings between the atria and the ventricles down into the ventricles. And when the ventricles contract, the blood in the ventricles is forced beneath the flaps, causing them to swing up and seal off that opening. So the blood then is pumped out into the pulmonary trunk and through this opening from the left ventricle into the aorta. The semilunar valves are one-way valves found between the ventricles and their arterial outlets. So there's two semilunar valves. One is the pulmonary semilunar valve found between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the other is the aortic semilunar valve found between the left ventricle and the aorta. The semilunar valves are made up of three pocket-shaped cusps. So this is a pocket, and the cusp associated with the semilunar valves are pocket-shaped. So it turns out that when a ventricle contracts, the blood can go past these pocket-shaped cusps up into the arterial outlets. But if the blood in the arterial outlets, the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, attempts to go back into the ventricles, the blood will catch the edge of the pocket-shaped cusps and fill up the pocket with blood, and these three pockets then swell outward to seal off that opening. So blood can get pumped out of the ventricles into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, but the blood can't return from these arteries back into the ventricles. So when the ventricles contract, and I'm only showing the right ventricle and the pulmonary semilunar valve, when the ventricles contract, they push blood against the flaps of the AV valves, causing those flaps to swing up and close. And the blood then goes out into an artery, either the pulmonary trunk, from the right ventricle or the aorta from the left ventricle. And if the blood in the arterial outlets attempts to go back into the ventricles, that can't occur because the blood will fill up these pocket-shaped flaps. They swell outward to seal off that opening. So here's an illustration showing the tricuspid valve between the right atrium and right ventricle, and the mitral or bicuspid valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Here you can see the chordae tendineae attached to the papillary muscles. Right here you're seeing the bottom of the pulmonary semilunar valves, and right next to it, within the wall of the left ventricle, you're seeing part of the bottom of the aortic semilunar valve. The heart skeleton. The heart skeleton is a band of dense connective tissue between the atria and the ventricles. It's made of dense connective tissue. There are no bones in the body, and there are no bones in the heart, despite the name heart skeleton. The heart skeleton refers to a band of dense connective tissue, and it's found between the atria and the ventricles. So the function of the heart skeleton is to provide a rigid support for the heart, the valves attached to it, and the heart skeleton prevents the cardiac impulse from spreading from the atria to the ventricles. So the heart skeleton is non-conducting dense connective tissue, and the cardiac impulse can only cross the heart skeleton by going across an electrical bridge-like structure known as the AV node. There are two structures associated with the fetal circulation that I'd like you to know. The ductus arteriosus and the foramen ovale. So it turns out that the fetus during a pregnancy is inside of a amniotic sac, and the amniotic sac is filled with a watery solution called the amniotic fluid. So the fetal lungs are filled with this amniotic fluid because it's floating in the fluid inside the amniotic sac, and the fetal lungs are non-functional in that they do not participate in gas exchange. So a fetus breathes by way of its umbilical cord to the placenta, and the placenta is the structure by which the fetus gains oxygen and gets rid of its carbon dioxide. So there are two fetal structures associated with the heart that help the fetal circulation bypass the pulmonary circuit. And the first of these two structures is the ductus arteriosus. The ductus arteriosus is a duct that shunts blood from the pulmonary trunk directly into the aorta, and that allows the blood to bypass the pulmonary circuit. This duct closes off at birth and is then called the ligamentum arteriosum. If the duct doesn't close off at birth, a kid is born with a condition known as patent ductus arteriosus. Patent ductus arteriosus is said to be a congenital defect. Congenital means present at birth. And generally, you just wait for a little while and it should close off naturally. If it doesn't, it can be surgically corrected. The other structure that I want you to know associated with the heart is the foramen ovale. And sometimes it's referred to as the hole in the heart. And the foramen ovale is an opening in the interatrial septum that shunts blood from the right atrium to the left atrium, thus bypassing the pulmonary circuit to the lungs. The foramen ovale, this opening in the interatrial septum, should seal off at birth. If it doesn't seal off at birth, a kid is born with a congenital, present at birth, defect called an interatrial septal defect. And that occurs if the foramen ovale doesn't seal properly. So this can be surgically corrected as well. When the foramen ovale seals off, it becomes what's known as the fossa ovalis. So let me write that. It seals off at birth to become the fossa ovalis. So down here is an illustration where I can show you those two structures. So the blood in the right atrium goes into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk, normally to the pulmonary circuit in the fetal lungs, but the fetal lungs are non-functional. So the blood in the pulmonary trunk goes through the ductus arteriosus, which is a fetal structure that seals off at birth to become the ligamentum arteriosum. But in the fetus, the blood in the pulmonary trunk goes through the ductus arteriosus into the aorta. And that's one of the two structures that I want you to know. The other structure I want you to know is a hole in the interatrial septum called the foramen ovale. So blood coming into the right atrium generally goes through this opening called the foramen ovale, directly into the left atrium to the left ventricle, and the left ventricle pumps that blood into the aorta. The blood that doesn't go through the foramen ovale, that goes down into the right ventricle, gets pumped into the pulmonary trunk through the ductus arteriosus and into the aorta. So both of these structures are designed to bypass the pulmonary circuit because the fetal lungs are filled with the amniotic fluid and non-functional. Each time the heart beats one time, it undergoes a series of mechanical events that are collectively referred to as the cardiac duty cycle. The cardiac duty cycle is a set of events that occur each time the heart beats one time. And that takes approximately 0.8 seconds in a resting individual. If your heart beats once every 0.8 seconds, it will beat roughly around 75 times per minute. So when a heart beats, a heart chamber undergoes systole and diastole. Systole is the contraction phase, when the cardiac muscle contracts and the heart chamber empties. So when the atria contract or undergo systole, they pump blood into the ventricles. And when the ventricles contract or undergo systole, they pump out their blood into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Diastole is when a heart chamber relaxes. And when a heart chamber relaxes, it fills up with blood. So this would be a set of events that occurs with each cardiac duty cycle, and every cardiac duty cycle is associated with one beat of the heart. The atria and the ventricles can't both contract at the same time. By the same token, they can't both be relaxed at the same time. So when the atria are contracting, the ventricles relax and fill with blood. And when the ventricles contract, the atria relax and fill with blood. So atrial contraction or atrial systole, when the atria are contracting, is accompanied by ventricular diastole as the ventricles fill with the blood coming into them. And then this set of coupled events is followed by the atria relaxing as they fill with blood, and the ventricles contracting as they pump blood out of the heart into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And then this set of events repeats itself. So atrial systole, ventricular diastole are coupled events, followed by atrial diastole and ventricular systole, and both of these sets of coupled events occur with one cardiac duty cycle each time the heart beats one time. Okay, just to talk a little bit about blood pressure. And generally, blood pressure is given for a resting individual. And blood pressure would measure changes that occur in the pressure of blood as the ventricles of the heart contract and relax. So blood pressure is generally taken with a blood pressure cuff that's placed over the brachial artery in the arm. And because you're getting pressure changes in the brachial artery, you would get a pressure for the systemic circuit. The device that's used to take blood pressure is called a sphygmomanometer, and it consists of three parts. There's a cuff that you inflate with air, and then there's a pressure meter, that's the manometer, for measuring air pressure in the cuff. And then finally there's a stethoscope so that you can listen to the sound that blood makes as it flows through the brachial artery. We'll be looking at the resting blood pressure associated with the systemic arterial system. So we're looking at systemic arterial blood pressure. And those blood pressure changes occur as the left ventricle contracts or undergoes systole, and then followed by the left ventricle relaxing or undergoing diastole. So when the left ventricle contracts, the systolic pressure in a resting individual goes up to about 120 millimeters of mercury. And then when the left ventricle relaxes or undergoes diastole, the blood pressure drops in the systemic arteries to around 75 millimeters of mercury. So these pressure changes typically are reported as 120 over 75. Now, these are averages, and in fact, the range of pressures that would still be within normal would be systolic pressures from 100 to 140, and diastolic pressures from, say, 60 to 90. In general, the pressure of greatest concern would be the diastolic pressure, because that's the least amount of pressure pushing against the major arteries. And as a result, that's a measure of the stress that they're always under. The pulmonary circuit doesn't experience pressures that are nearly as high as the systemic circuit. So when you look at the resting blood pressure in the pulmonary arteries or the pulmonary trunk, as the right ventricle contracts during systole and relaxes during diastole, the resting blood pressure in the pulmonary circuit would be something like 25 over 10. The right ventricle, as a result, isn't as strong a pump as the left ventricle, because the right ventricle never has to generate pressures that are anywhere near as high as the pressures the left ventricle generates in the systemic circuit. So it turns out the lungs are on either side of the heart, and as a result, there's less resistance to the flow of blood because the pulmonary circuit doesn't have to counteract the effect of pushing blood against gravity. There's a system that helps to control blood pressure that I want you to know something about, called the renin-angiotensin system. And it begins with a plasma protein that's synthesized by liver cells that circulates in blood at all times, called angiotensinogen. So when the blood pressure in the kidney drops lower than normal, kidney cells release an enzyme called renin into the blood. And renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted by an enzyme in the lungs called ACE, or ACE, that stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. And ACE converts the angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a powerful vasoconstrictor that acts to raise blood pressure back to normal. So we can kind of see this down here with this flow chart. This is a homeostatic mechanism that helps to take care of a deviation away from normal. So we start with a normal blood pressure and assume that the blood pressure in the kidney drops below normal. Kidney cells can detect that drop in blood pressure. And in response, they release an enzyme called renin. And renin then converts a plasma protein known as angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 is converted by an enzyme found primarily in the lungs called ACE, for angiotensin converting enzyme. And ACE converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. That's the end of the line for this cascade of reactions. Angiotensin causes vasoconstriction, which increases the peripheral resistance, and that in turn will raise the blood pressure back to normal. If someone has a high resting blood pressure, they have what's called hypertension. And sometimes an individual with higher than normal resting blood pressure isn't even aware that they have hypertension. But the hypertension can do damage to the heart and blood vessels that can lead to a person's death. And that's why hypertension is sometimes known as the silent killer. Hypertension would be higher than normal resting blood pressures above or equal to 140/90. Hypertension, this high blood pressure, over time can damage the heart because it forces the heart to work harder to generate these higher pressures all of the time. And these higher pressures over time can strain major arteries and cause tearing in their inner lining. And those tears that occur can serve as focal points for the development of atherosclerosis, and that in turn can lead to all kinds of problems, to include heart attacks and strokes. So the risk factors for developing hypertension, which is actually pretty common, include obesity, lack of exercise, a diet that is high in fat. Cigarette smoking can lead to hypertension. Chronic psychological stress, stress from relationships with, like a boss or fellow workers, a marriage that is struggling. All of these can result in chronic psychological stress that contributes to hypertension. And in general, hypertension is seen in individuals, as they get older. So being over 40 years of age would be a risk factor for hypertension. The heart makes two sounds as it beats one time. And these sounds would be a lub sound and a dup sound. So if you put your ear to someone's chest, each time the heart beats once, you can hear lub dup, lub dup, lub dup. The heart sounds occur when the one-way valves snap shut. And when the one-way valves snap shut, the heart shakes and creates a sound. You can kind of see this with a piece of paper. So when the valves close, the heart shakes and makes a sound. And then when they close again, you get a sound. So when something shakes, it will produce a sound. The lub sound is also known as S1, or the first heart sound, and it occurs as the ventricles contract and the AV valves snap shut. When the AV valves snap shut, the heart shakes and makes a sound. Second heart sound is the dup, or S2, and it occurs when the ventricles relax and the semilunar valves close. That causes the heart to shake and create the second heart sound. We're going to find that the lub sound, or S1, occurs during the QRS complex of an EKG, and the dup sound occurs at the end of the T wave during an EKG. So we're going to talk a little bit about some properties associated with cardiac muscle cells. First of all, cardiac muscle is said to be myogenic, and that means that the cardiac impulse, which actually stimulates the heart to contract, originates within cardiac muscle cells. So we'll talk about a group of special cardiac muscle cells known as the SA node. And these cardiac muscle cells, without any innervation from the nervous system, can self-stimulate by generating what's known as the cardiac impulse. Cardiac muscle cells have a long refractory period. So refractory means resistant to stimulation. And a refractory period is the amount of time a muscle spends after it's contracted before it will contract again. It's kind of like a period of time that a muscle has to rest after it's contracted before it will contract again. That period of time in which it has to rest is known as the refractory period. And that period is very long in cardiac muscle cells. In fact, it's around 250 milliseconds. So a cardiac muscle cell will contract, and then it can't be stimulated to contract again until 250 milliseconds, which is a quarter of a second, has passed. That's a very long refractory period, and it means that cardiac muscle cells, unlike skeletal muscle cells that have a short refractory period, can't tetanize or undergo a sustained contraction. Another cardiac muscle property is the presence of large numbers of mitochondria. So a cardiac muscle cell would contain thousands of mitochondria because cardiac muscle cells are very, very active. Every second of every day throughout your entire life, cardiac muscle cells can't ever rest. The heart can't ever stop beating for a little while. It has to beat continuously all the time, without fail, or the consequence would be death. So cardiac muscle cells have a lot of mitochondria in order to generate a lot of ATP that's required for the contraction of these cells. There are special connections between cardiac muscle cells known as intercalated discs, and they're unique to cardiac muscle cells. So an intercalated disc occurs where two cardiac muscle cells meet, and the intercalated disc consists of desmosomes, which anchor the cells together so they don't pull apart, and collections of tiny tubes known as gap junctions. And the desmosomes and the gap junctions together make up an intercalated disc, which is a junction found where two cardiac muscle cells meet. Intercalated discs are important because they allow a cardiac impulse to spread from one cardiac muscle cell to another. Cardiac muscle cells are unusual in that they are branched. So a cardiac muscle cell would branch, and each of the branches would form intercalated discs with additional cells that would branch. So one cell interacts with two cells, and these two cells would interact with four cells. And these four cells would interact with 8 cells, then 16, 32, 64, and all the way up the line. So when the cardiac impulse spreads across the heart, you get a multiplier effect, because one cell will pass the cardiac impulse to 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, etc. And that means that there is this multiplier effect that spreads the cardiac impulse from one cardiac muscle cell to another very rapidly. So we're going to look at the way in which the cardiac impulse that's generated by the SA node spreads across the heart. And we're going to look at what's called the cardiac conduction system. And this is a system of structures that helps to spread the cardiac impulse across the heart very, very rapidly. So the cardiac conduction system consists of structures that are made of cardiac muscle cells, but they're special cardiac muscle cells that aren't contractile. And they will generate the cardiac impulse and then spread it across the heart very quickly. So the structures of the cardiac conduction system include the sinoatrial node, also known as the SA node, and sometimes called the pacemaker of the heart. The term pace and pacemaker refers to the heart rate. So the pace of the heart is the number of beats per minute, or the heart rate. The special non-contractile cardiac muscle cells that make up the SA node generate what's known as the cardiac impulse. And then the cardiac impulse spreads out from the SA node to the rest of the heart. The SA node, when it creates the cardiac impulse, is said to fire. So when the SA node fires, you get a cardiac impulse that spreads across the heart and stimulates the heart to contract. So the firing rate of the SA node would be the same as the heart rate. If the SA node fires 75 times in a minute, the heart would beat 75 times that minute, and the heart rate would be 75 beats per minute. The SA node is located in the wall of the right atrium where the superior vena cava comes in. Another structure associated with the cardiac conduction system is the atrioventricular node, or the AV node. So the cardiac impulse can't pass through the non-conducting, dense connective tissue of the heart skeleton found between the atria and the ventricles. The only way the cardiac impulse can pass through the heart skeleton is to travel across a structure known as the atrioventricular node, or the AV node. And the AV node allows the cardiac impulse to spread through the heart skeleton from the atria to the ventricles. The function of the AV node is, one, to allow the cardiac impulse to spread from the atria to the ventricles through the heart skeleton, and two, to delay the spread of the cardiac impulse by 1/10 of a second. 1/10 of a second would be 100 milliseconds. And this delay in the spread of the cardiac impulse through the AV node from the atria to the ventricles is known as the AV node delay. It's not a long period of time, it's just a fraction of a second, but it's long enough, the AV node delay, for the atria to empty and the ventricles to fill. The rest of the cardiac conduction system beyond the AV node is found in the ventricles and includes the AV bundle, bundle branches, and special cardiac muscle cells known as Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers are special non-contractile cardiac muscle cells that help to rapidly spread the cardiac impulse to all parts of the ventricular myocardium. So this would be the SA node in the wall of the right atrium, near where the superior vena cava comes in. It's the pacemaker of the heart that generates a cardiac impulse. And when the SA node fires, a cardiac impulse spreads across the atria, stimulating the atrial cardiac muscle cells to contract. As the atria are contracting, the cardiac impulse is passing through the AV node, and it goes more slowly than it would otherwise because of the AV node delay by about 100 milliseconds. Once the cardiac impulse gets to the other side of the AV node, the atria have had time to empty and the ventricles time to fill, and then the impulse spreads rapidly through the ventricular myocardium by way of the AV bundle, bundle branches, and a network of Purkinje fibers. And the spread of the cardiac impulse through the ventricular myocardium causes the ventricles to contract. The spread of the cardiac impulse across the heart can be traced by an electrocardiogram. So an electrocardiogram is spelled with a C and sometimes referred to as an ECG, but you can also replace the C with a K and call it an EKG. So the electrocardiogram can be referred to as an ECG or an EKG. Most people like the hard sound of the K compared to the softer sound of a C, and so normally you hear people refer to the electrocardiogram as an EKG. So the electrocardiogram is a tracing of the cardiac impulse spreading across the heart, and the EKG tracing is taken with a device called an electrocardiograph. So an electrocardiograph is the device that creates a tracing or a graph known as the electrocardiogram or an EKG. The path that the cardiac impulse takes across the heart that's tracked by the EKG is the cardiac impulse is generated by the SA node, and then it spreads across the atria, and then across the AV node into the ventricles, where it spreads by way of the AV bundle, bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers throughout the ventricular myocardium. There are 5 waves in an EKG tracing: the P wave, the Q wave, the R wave, the S wave, and the T wave. The Q, R, and S waves are collectively referred to as the QRS complex. So the P wave is the first of these 5 waves, and the P wave is also known as atrial depolarization, and I do want you to know that. The P wave begins as the SA node fires and generates a cardiac impulse, and then the P wave continues as the cardiac impulse spreads across the atria. So the P wave is the spreading of the cardiac impulse from the SA node across the atria, and that's the stimulus for the contraction of the cardiac muscle cells in the wall of the atria. So the P wave is associated with atrial systole, when the atria are contracting and moving blood from the atria down into the ventricles. The QRS complex is also known as ventricular depolarization. And the QRS complex is a series of 3 waves, the Q, R, and the X, S, which are collectively referred to as the QRS complex. And the QRS complex occurs as the cardiac impulse leaves the AV node and spreads through the ventricular myocardium. The QRS complex is the spread of the cardiac impulse across the ventricles that stimulates the cardiac muscle cells in the wall of the ventricles to contract, and that would be ventricular systole, as the contracting ventricles undergoing systole are pumping blood out into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. The T wave is the last of the 5 waves, and it's also known as ventricular repolarization, and it begins about 250 milliseconds after the start of the QRS complex, and it's associated with the relaxation of the ventricles, or ventricular diastole. So the P wave is associated with atrial systole, the QRS complex with ventricular systole, and the T wave is associated with the relaxation or diastole phase of the ventricles. When you study an EKG tracing, often it's labeled with intervals and segments. So an interval is a period of time in milliseconds that always contains 1 or more waves. And a segment is a period of time in milliseconds found between waves. So there's a couple of these that I want you to know. One is the PR interval. And the PR interval goes from the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS complex. And it would be the time for the atria to contract and the cardiac impulse to spread across the AV node. The PR segment is the time it takes for the cardiac impulse to travel through the AV node. So the PR segment is the time associated with the AV node delay. The QT interval is a measurement of time in milliseconds from the start of the QRS complex to the end of the T wave, and it's the time it takes the ventricles to contract and relax. This is an EKG tracing showing all 5 of these waves. So when the SA node fires, the cardiac impulse spreads across the atria to generate the P wave. And the spread of the cardiac impulse across the atria stimulates cardiac muscle cells in the wall of the atria to contract, and that would be atrial systole. Once the cardiac impulse spreads across the atria, it goes through the AV node. And the spread of the impulse through the AV node slows down. That's the AV node delay. And the AV node delay is also shown by the PR segment. Once the impulse leaves the AV node, it generates 3 waves known as the QRS complex. The first wave is the Q wave, and it goes from here and just back up. So this right here is the Q wave. And then after the Q wave, you get the R wave, That's by far the tallest wave associated with a EKG. And then after the R wave, you generate an S wave. And the Q and the R and the S waves together make up the QRS complex. The QRS complex is the spread of the cardiac impulse across the ventricles, and it will stimulate ventricular systole. When the ventricles contract, the AV valves close, and that shakes the heart to create the first heart sound, S1, or the lub sound. About 250 milliseconds beyond the beginning of the QRS complex, we get the T wave. And the T wave represents the relaxation of the ventricles, or ventricular diastole. When the ventricles fully relax, the semilunar valves close, shake the heart, and that creates the second heart sound, or the DUP sound. So the P wave is also known as atrial depolarization. The QRS complex is also known as ventricular depolarization, and the T wave is known as ventricular repolarization.